priorities and projects, but of course people and places are critical to all of them. And I speak as a professional, as an architect, an urban designer, as an independent person, and I think that I won't read out the quote, if people could just read that themselves, from Richard Johnson, one of our best architects. It really talks to the ethical positions that professionals, a bit of an old-fashioned view that professionals should take relative to society. And I think we don't hear anywhere near enough from all the professions in the built environment putting an independent voice, sometimes a fearless voice, sometimes a voice you may not agree with, but a voice which is hopefully informed by decades of practice and a deep knowledge not only and love of our city, but in fact of cities more general and an environment more generally. And in fact I think we should be talking about celebrating the cities. I see it as incredibly positive. It might mean that I disagree with most of you on some points and agree with you all on others. I think one of the problems of the city, aside from Chris Johnson, is that Treasury have far too big a voice. And what Treasury and economists more generally particularly don't understand is these two fundamental things about the city. It's a physical place and it exists in the long time frame. They're used to short-term funding. They simply don't get the genuine economies of cities, and they need to, because Sydney and other Australian cities have been suffering hugely because of this lack of understanding. What increasingly they don't get at the moment is this balance between public and private. We need both. We need both to be strong. And at the moment what we have is the public sector being phenomenally weak, weaker than it's perhaps been in not only our lifetimes, but in fact almost in the history of Australian cities. So I won't read the quote again. This is the last quote I'll put up, but it's from a fantastic book which I'd encourage you to read about the loss of public space and local democracy in England, called Ground Control, by a journalist in England. And you'll notice some of the tendencies, if you read this book, are very much at play in Australia. Maybe England's gone further down this track, and in fact some of the players are in fact leading Australian companies. And what you see is a real loss of public imagination, public trust, valuing of public assets, and not just in a financial sense. These are of course the great sandstone buildings of Bridge Street, which are currently for sale to the lowest tenderer, because they've only got two, I think. But look at these buildings. It's not just the buildings themselves, which are some of the best buildings, particularly the Lands Department, after the Opera House, probably as good a building ever built in Sydney by public hands, by the great government architect, Barnett. But in fact they're on sites which have been in public ownership back to Aboriginal occupation, where of course in a sense there was no private ownership. The sites have always, over 230 years, public authorities have been able to reimagine public purposes for these sites and these structures. What has changed? What have we lost that 230 years of society has so well understood? And this is certainly something that we talked about a lot in our book, Public Sydney. I won't give it more of a plug than that. But there are lots of other buildings such as this, and the Powerhouse that completely support David Borges' push and the Premier's push for bringing cultural funding to Western Sydney. It's long, long, long overdue. And in fact we need a lot more than they're talking about, but at least it's a start. But it doesn't mean we need to sell this off to developers. This is a powerhouse. The character of the place actually gave the function. It was across the road, you might remember, and here's a photo of it actually under construction in 1984. So surely we've got enough material in the house collection to have both, and to have quite a different, fantastic new museum in Parramatta that's a complement, a contrast, maybe even the headquarters rather than this one, but don't have to throw this one out. There have been many politicians, I'm putting up one bad one, but out of many that I could put up. But in fact this is also a change, because my first job was on Darling Harbour. I couldn't believe the smash up and waste and trash of the project in 1984-85. I can't believe we're doing it again just 30 years later. Why have we got such a disposable city? On what economic or environmental grounds would you throw all this away? But it's not only that you're throwing it away, because at least Brereton was pushing a public project. These were all government buildings on government land. What's happened is now is they're actually private buildings on government land that are built as short-term facilities, because we'll be back here in 30 years' time knocking those buildings down again. How dumb are we if we think that that's a good way to build a city, and what a contrast that is to the values embodied in the Lands Department. Of course, just up on the hill, there's Miller's Point, the best public housing built anywhere in the world by the engineers of the Harbour Trust in 1906 when they built High Street, continuously occupied across generations. This is a great cultural asset, societal asset. It's not just about flogging a bit of real estate. That is completely the wrong way around. And of course, this is the pointy end, because Barangaroo, which you see on the right of the slide, has abandoned its meagre affordable housing contribution. And here we're also now losing our public housing just nearby. Again, 100 years of different custodians, government custodians. What have we changed now that we can't value what generations have implicitly understood as being a public good? Barangaroo, I couldn't not mention it. I'm not going to dwell on it. People say, are you bitter? Well, I'm not bitter as an architect, because we never had the expectation we'd do any substantial part other than perhaps the public structure and the public spaces. I'm extremely bitter as a citizen of the city, and that's why I continue to speak up as a citizen, because I think what's been done at Barangaroo shows you so many of the problems that really beset our city, and they're, of course, across both sides of politics. This is our competition scheme on the far side, this week's version on this side. What you've lost is on 22 hectares of public land in the middle of our city, you've lost any ability of the government to actually set the agenda in our best interests. Instead, they're an ideas-free zone. The developers have all the money and all the ideas, their own ideas, of course, in their own interests, and they simply can do what they want. Here's their latest sort of spin brochure of the big glossy buildings. There's less and less of them, and they're bigger and bigger. What a surprise, because they can write their own planning rules, and if you look at Modification 8, it's simply another grab bag. Sounds like 9%, not very much. It's actually 30 or 40,000 square metres. That's actually a whole city office block for free, effectively, on our land. One of my favourite cartoons. If only it was just a question of it being ugly. But it's not. And I don't think it's a bottle of Grange in here. The real problem with this is a lack of transparency. Why are contracts that are between the New South Wales government, that is us, and a private developer, redacted? It's our interest, including our financial interests, that we're actually being denied knowledge of. It's simply not good enough. And these are not innocent businessmen simply trying to do the best for them and their shareholders. Lend-Lease have really got form. We talk about a global city. I think we're just a bit of a dumb company town. And if you look up the western side of the city, Lend-Lease, Lend-Lease, Lend-Lease. And if you're following the controversy with the road toll in Melbourne, the toll road in Melbourne, is a particular disgrace that there could be a secret contract on the side. And as for Packer, well, he'll have paid his dues just with his penthouse. He's always had more apartments. The casino is a minor thing. It's a Trojan horse for profit making on public land, and we've all been sold this done. Yeah. Whereas when we won the competition, what we said to the jury, the reason that we won on their terms and their jury selected us against the other big players in the room, was that we saw Barangaroo, or as it was then East Darling Harbour, its most important thing was how it made Sydney, the whole city, in better contact with the harbour. Its public transport was critical. Its streets were critical. Its foreshore was critical. And the principle was that the whole foreshore would be inalienable public land. And that's what we said, because we've worked up and down the harbour and we know what the development interest wants. They want to actually exclude the wider public. So our scheme not only had the entire foreshore as a park, continuous, open, accessible, it had a street system. And the streets make the park more public and more accessible and keep the developers behind their line. When Lend-Lease are fudging whether they got to 50% or not on the public space, we had 74% as public space because we had the 50% of the park plus the streets. They've just given away streets, their driveways and shopping malls, and they're just port cachets to casinos and the like. We have lost, the people of New South Wales, and we haven't lost just in the Treasury life cycle. We've lost because these are fixed assets which last lifetimes. And of course we characterised our scheme. Just a little comment always in this corner here which just gets a bit obliterated. We really see public space as the physical embodiment of democratic society itself. It's our collective space, and we don't talk about it anywhere near enough, and we don't defend it and promote it anywhere near enough at any level. So what I want to talk about is public projects. I did say I had too much. I'm going to talk a little bit about transport infrastructure. Let's start big. When we talk about a very fast train, let's not talk about a piece of engineering. Let's start with a discussion about a national population strategy. And let's also factor in the true economics and environmental factors in that. Because we do have a whole continent, we're incredibly lucky, but we choose to cluster in our capital cities. Not a very great way to use land. And the pressure it puts on our capital cities is also huge. So if the equation was rebalanced in this terms, not in the negative sense of decentralisation, but in the positive sense of a population strategy, well then maybe the whole economics of this might be thought of in quite a different way. And there's a huge problem when, even at WestConnect's talk last night, talking about the business case. Completely the wrong way of thinking. It's not a business case because we're not a business, we're actually a society. What we need to have is a real process of valuing the things that matter, and some of them aren't tangible. Jeanette said I shouldn't talk about just Sydney. Absolutely, I've been following the smash up in Newcastle. Really, you shouldn't be throwing away investment in fixed assets, and you shouldn't have the government development agency up here with the GPT development simply promoting a high density which is otherwise applicable in the city centre. Not that I'm against density, as you'll see. We've thrown away transport infrastructure before to our cost. Has there ever been a worse environmental economic decision than to rip up Sydney's trams? I should also add Newcastle's trams. And look how much we had in Sydney, 190 miles, 360 kilometres, one of the biggest systems in the world. We didn't just throw away, bigger than Melbourne. And when you look at Sydney, this is, I'll use a lot of maps if people just get a bit, this is the city centre. On the left is the tram network, and it's fantastic coverage. Now we've of course got one tram line. Luckily we are, due to the city and Minister Berejiklian's leadership, we are going to have more. But we've got a long way to catch up with what we threw away before. And in fact, when you look, and this is work we did with the city on Sydney 2030, when you look at the fixed transport infrastructure in our city, it's actually deplorable by any international benchmark. We have only 32 kilometres of fixed track within the 26 square kilometres of the city of Sydney. If you put that same city of Sydney footprint over other cities, you see they've got 5-10 times as much fixed infrastructure. So we've got an over-concentration on the city circle. We need more coverage. Let's look at how Sydney's grown. Here's Sydney back in 1940. Couple of million people. It grew with sprawl after the war. The train system in Sydney, again, a fantastic public investment, starting with the Parramatta line back in the 1850s. We had built up to the 1940s 144 stations and 354 kilometres of track. In the next 70 years, we added only 13 stations and 38 kilometres of track, yet our population doubled. This is a complete failure of post-war planning with its dependence on cars. And most of those projects are actually truncated pieces. Eastern Suburbs line to Spur, the line to Epping, of course, should have gone to Parramatta and the like. And thankfully there are some proposals, some of them started by the local government, many of them pushed forward by our current minister, which do deserve, including the tramlines, praise. But this is where I get perhaps controversial, and I actually advocate for the broader public interest, and sometimes it's might be against more localised community interest, that really I think we should be intensifying the bits of Sydney that are absolutely fantastic. We shouldn't be saying that the coast and the harbour is full, that it's finished. We should actually be, first of all, leading with public transport, and this is where the global city is, this is where the jobs are, this is where the environment is, all the existing services. This is actually the area that should be doing the heavy lifting in terms of density, not the other way around. And if you think that that's actually too ambitious a project, I'll just remind you in terms of infrastructure, we have built 200 kilometres of motorways in the last few decades, so we actually can do infrastructure when we put our minds to it. But we shouldn't do the wrong infrastructure. And WestConnex is absolutely the wrong infrastructure in the 21st century. As we heard last night, it was a 1960s idea. Because this is the reality, and this is just a bus, not even a train. This is to move the same number of people, how much space you need. Cars not only pollute, they just take up so much room. They're incredibly inefficient. If the mayor of Bogota can get it right, why can't our Prime Minister? But it's also a question of quality. And so when we build transport infrastructure, they're almost designed by some transport engineers who've never caught a bus or a train or walked between the two. Why do we make such miserable experiences of these places? And in fact, the problem of the city is a problem we can solve. The scars of infrastructure are actually much more a limitation on our city centre than the wonderful geography of our harbour, if we have the vision to change it. And it's about planning rather than being reactive, and about development. It should be about making the city better for all of us. And so it needs to be predictive, it needs to have vision. It needs to not only have vision, it needs to actually define itself in terms of programs and projects. So this is looking at the city centre. Bradfield understood this very well with the bridge. He also understood funding. Of course, the bridge is paid for by debt, and it's paid off over decades by the toll. The only tollway, the tollway was then a new form of funding infrastructure. Wouldn't it be good if our Treasury boffins actually thought of new ways of doing it, rather than relying on what private developers suggested? I'll quickly just run through some broader ideas. Greening Sydney, absolutely essential. Here's Surrey Hills from Cleveland Street at the bottom in 1949. Here it is today. We actually are greening our city. We have done that. But yesterday in Western Sydney, in Guildford, where it's much, much hotter across Western Sydney, why isn't there a positive landscape project, suburb by suburb, street by street? And it's not just a question of the poles and wires being sold. Well, first of all, we should be undergrounding them and actually giving the landscape the priority. Yeah. We also need to think about parks, and here, again, there is a question of balance. This is, of course, within Governor Macquarie's 1,000 acres, Centennial Park's created, but in fact the edge of that park, and the park is funded through targeted land sales around the perimeter, which made the perimeter streets and allowed the park to be defined. And it's easy to overlook that today. That decision was made 20 years after the park had been gazetted in 1905. The same possibilities arise in Western Sydney. Again, fantastic. There's some funding for Western Sydney Parkland announced the other day. These sorts of places can evolve across centuries. We need to think that's the time frame of cities. It's not 4-year election cycles. Density. Forget zoning. It's failed. It's another dinosaur of the 20th century. What we need is diverse places to live, work and play. And we need all sorts of different ones that celebrate their place, their locality, their wonderful assets, such as in Coogee. We need to stop sprawl. Really, is there a reason to subdivide another farm on our perimeter, to threaten another ecosystem? Surely we've got enough land, and if I didn't put in any of the slides of us compared to other world cities, but we have a huge footprint for a low population. We don't need to be densifying the fringe, the perimeter. This is announced the other day. High density centres are decent. Why is the inner city actually, why is density locked out of those areas? I think that we've got completely this wrong at a metropolitan scale. And I know that will be a challenge to lots of people in the room. Again, the other day flying over, this is the M5, Camden Valley Way, the new railway line. Why are we putting new housing the areas with the lowest amenity. Why do we put the highest densities of apartment buildings on the noisiest, most polluted roads, when actually this is where the most people are going to live? What sort of societal thinking is that? When actually we've got so much land, we're concentrating these sort of high-rise clusters. This is Cogra, Hurstville's over here, Rockdale, which is a particularly severe environment. Surely we've got it all back to front. I told you that's too much, I'm sorry. What if we followed the example of the London Squares, which after all are real estate mechanisms? This is looking at a park. It could be anywhere in metropolitan Sydney, has 100 houses, it's a real park. 100 houses facing it. The houses, of course, have a backyard. You can't see the park because of front fences and cars parked. What if we inverted that and actually said the highest amenity is actually where you want the highest density? You could put 800 plus apartments where the 100 houses are currently. You get a difference in scale of this, so it's mid-rise, it's not high-rise. I think you can do a lot with 4 to 6 stories. And of course, every living room can look at the park, and the people use the park because they don't have the same private space that a house has got. This is much more sensible idea of planning. We never hear it advocated. I can go on, but in the interest of equity, I might stop there. Thank you very much.